Good morning. It's Wednesday, May 6th, and we're continuing our series in the Cold War. Yesterday, we got to the end of the Korean War. The Korean conflict was really one of the early major active zones within the Cold War. And it was one of those what we call about proxy wars. It was really a battle between North Korea and South Korea, but North Korea stood for both Communist China and the Soviet Union, and South Korea stood for the United States. So the two larger powers fought each other through smaller nations. And today we're going to move on to another one of the proxy wars within the Cold War. Before we get there, I do need to remind you today, quiz 22 is due. If you're going to turn it in handwritten, it needs to be submitted with the packet that's being submitted to the school today. If you were going to email it me, that's fine, but it's due to me by midnight tonight. So open book, open notes, open video, use whatever you need. Do not work together and do not plagiarize. You should not be using word for word. At least 100 words. You need to say or answer the question, what made America such a powerful combatant in World War II? Many different ways of doing that. I'll leave that to your discretion. But that is the quiz. By the way, and this stands for everything. If you are late in turning something in, still turn it in. I am giving credit even if it's late. So do the work, even if it's not right on time. Make sure you do the work. All right. Having said that, let's move into our material. So the next flare-up in the Cold War was in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was and is a complex issue that has stirred a lot of emotions in America. It is not just as simple as what you think about the war. It has a lot to do with what you think about the United States and what you think about the role of the U.S., and there's a lot to it. So we're not going to get to all that. I'm going to do the best I can to explain the history behind the war, but understand some people who support the war do it for reasons beyond just the war itself, and some people who oppose the war do it for reasons beyond the war itself. That's its own issue that is better dealt with in American history. Vietnam started with the loss of the French Empire after World War II. Remember, World War II, France is utterly rolled by the Germans. The remains of France is formulated into Vichy France, which is subservient to Germany. During that time, all French overseas possessions essentially became independent in a way because France was unable to assist them or protect them or support them. That included what was called French Indochina. Now, we'll get to that in a moment. Now, after France is restored in World War II by the Allies, by the Americans, and by the British, Charles de Gaulle, who was the general in charge of the Free French armies, he becomes the president of France. He was determined to restore French prestige after the embarrassment of World War II. Charles de Gaulle is quite honestly a poor but very proud ruler of France. And he probably did as best as any other Frenchman could. That's more of a reflection on the state of France after World War II. But he is determined to make France once again a major world power, except France wasn't. And France had been thoroughly dominated by the Germans. They didn't have the same prestige or the standing that the British, the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Canadians, the Americans, and all these other nations who had, well, maintain their independence. So he was determined to restore French prestige. He thought this would best be accomplished by regaining the French Empire that existed before World War II. This included French Indochina, which is also called Vietnam. Vietnam's its real name. French Indochina is what the French called it. So during the war, Vietnam had suffered under Japanese rule. They had fought hard for their independence. They were largely led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh, before the Japanese invasion, had fought the French. He was always looking to secure an independent Vietnam. And then when the Japanese invaded, he had fought the Japanese. Ho Chi Minh didn't care what nation you were from. He simply wanted an independent Vietnam. He was a communist, but Ho Chi Minh was not fundamentally a communist. His most important priority was nationalism. And by that I mean Ho Chi Minh was flexible on what economic and political system was in place, so long as Vietnam was being governed by the Vietnamese. Now, I'm not saying Ho Chi Minh is a good man. I'm not saying he's a freedom fighter. It's a lot more complex than that. But Ho Chi Minh's primary concern was that Vietnam should be controlled by the Vietnamese. In 1954, Ho Chi Minh was able to lead his forces to an important victory over the French and French loyalists at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And I know I'm mispronouncing things, I apologize for that, but this was a major development. Here you had what used to be a colony rising up and once again casting off colonial overlords. This was originally intended to be a trap for the Viet Minh. That was the name of Ho Chi Minh's group. The French had set up what they thought would be an ambush, and they thought they would defeat Ho Chi Minh and his fighters, but instead they lost. It turned into a siege for the French, and you can see here the French soldiers marching away, having been defeated and captured by the Vietnamese. The entire French force was compelled to surrender. This should have ended any French hope in the region. What should have happened is the French forces should have gone home, Vietnam should have been declared independent, and the matter should have been forgotten. In the negotiations that followed, what happens was Vietnam was divided into two parts, which is not what Vietnam wanted primarily. The North became communist and the South was French. So we had North Vietnam and South Vietnam, much like what had happened in Korea. In the South, a group who were loyal to Ho Chi Minh and loyal to the idea of a united Vietnam rose up, and they were called the Viet Cong. They were intent on restoring Vietnam to unity and doing it under the authority of Ho Chi Minh, who was still communist. It was, in one way, it was a battle of communism and democracy, but primarily, I believe, it was a battle of independence and enslavement. It's a complicated issue. There are no easy answers here. It's a picture of Ho Chi Minh before his passing. He was a leader to Vietnam for many years. In 1954, SEATO was formed. That stands for Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It was intended to be kind of the counterpart to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The West was still in the policy of containment. Remember the Truman Doctrine? The Truman Doctrine says if we keep communism caged in, it'll eventually collapse under its own failures. The belief was that forming organization, whether whether it was NATO or whether it was SEATO, would help. So under President Dwight Eisenhower, the former general who had now become president, a new idea developed called the domino theory. And the domino theory believed this, that if one nation fell to communism, then the next nearby nation would fall as well. And this was in line with containment, the Truman Doctrine. So the Truman Doctrine says keep communism contained, and the domino theory says if one nation falls, others are going to fall. So it becomes important every time a single nation begins to flirt with communism, you had to stop it immediately, or else the whole region would become communist and containment would fail. So it was imperative to do this. Under President Eisenhower, a few military advisors were sent to South Vietnam to instruct the anti-communist forces. So they did not fight, they only trained. It was about 600 men. Now I'd point out, under Dwight Eisenhower, this sending of military advisors, this assistance was relatively common. It was available to other nations. It was simply a matter of the Americans training what could be allies in fighting maneuvers that the Americans were familiar with. Excuse me. It was not very uncommon to see this. The Vietnam conflict probably would have become a forgettable blip in world history, except for President John Kennedy. From 1955 to 1960, the South held on, though it appeared obvious that eventually the North was going to possess the whole country. The South just didn't have the force, the power, the prestige, the leadership. The South was led by President Diem. He was corrupt. He was largely disliked by the people. Whereas Ho Chi Minh in the North was worshipped. President Diem was despised. His corruption was legendary. He was supported by the local warlords, it wasn't by the people. So in 1960, the United States elected John Kennedy to replace Dwight Eisenhower. He had served 2 terms, he was retiring. So young President Kennedy, a Democrat, becomes the leader of not only the United States, but really of the free world. Kennedy won with the overwhelming support of the American media, who refused to really broadcast any of the negative stories concerning President Kennedy, and there were many. President Kennedy, as a human being, was a disgusting human being who used his position of authority to seduce and really overwhelm young women and had affairs with many of them. Today it would be considered not quite statutory rape, but certainly sexual assault what he did, and he did it dozens, if not hundreds of times. He was a weak-minded man. He's given a lot of credit for things he had nothing to do with, but it shows you the power of having the reporters on your side. Why is Douglas MacArthur considered as great a general as men like Eisenhower and Bradley and Patton? Well, because he had reporters who told his story in the same way Kennedy had reporters who told his story, and they told a myth, one that is not true. Kennedy was considered inexperienced, and he wanted to prove his toughness because early on in his reign, he had been involved in the botched Bay of Pigs invasion, and it was a fiasco. And to be fair, the Bay of Pigs invasion was not primarily Kennedy's fault. Well, he shared. The Bay of Pigs invasion was an invasion of. So Cuba had become communist in the late 1950s, and a number of Cuban nationals in America made a plan to invade Cuba, their homeland, and throw out the communist dictator Fidel Castro. Originally, the Americans promised air support at the last, and Kennedy at that moment should have ended the operation, but he didn't. But at the last moment, he denied air support. So all these Cuban nationals who invaded Cuba were just slaughtered on the beaches because they had been abandoned by Kennedy, who dithered on making a decision until the decision was made too late to do it. So he needed to prove to America that he wasn't this incompetent lightweight. Because in early negotiations with the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, Khrushchev had bullied and beaten Kennedy. It was obvious that Kennedy could not stand his ground to these more powerful men. So Kennedy needed to prove his toughness. And so he made the decision to escalate. So during his administration, 16,000 American soldiers were sent to Vietnam. It was President John Kennedy that decided that Vietnam was going to be a place where America would take a stand. But the stand was not primarily made because Vietnam was important. Vietnam was insignificant. The stand was made because President Kennedy needed to prove his toughness, because the Democratic Party and President were considered weak on international affairs, especially communist aggression. So the American strategy was to equip and to train the South Vietnamese and let them do the fighting, except there are 16,000 American soldiers there. The South Vietnamese were incompetent, and promotion was based on political concerns. So their officers, their leaders, were hesitant and inept. The leaders of the South Vietnamese were those who were friends with President Diem and friends with local warlords, not those who were actually good at their job. So the South Vietnamese consistently lost battles against much smaller and less equipped forces. President Diem spent most of his time fighting off failed coup attempts from various groups who wanted to kill him and take over the government. President Diem continued to make enemies among his own nation. At the time, his brother was the head of the secret police and frequently used murder as a tactic, and that just encouraged general widespread hatred for him. With the help of the American CIA, President Diem, who was no longer useful, eventually was assassinated. This led to a series of unstable short-term governments. By this time, in the United States, President Kennedy was also assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. So most of the world was in a state of serious turmoil. Kennedy was replaced by his vice president, President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson was a base man, and by that I mean an unworthy man, a disgusting man, who was only chosen based on his ability to carry the state of Texas because they needed the electoral votes. He was never intended to be president. He had been a senator for years and ruled the Senate with a rod of iron. And as I mentioned, he personally, like Kennedy, is a poor human being. He wanted to drastically increase American activity in Vietnam. Like Kennedy, he wanted to prove his toughness. So he wanted to make America look strong, but primarily he wanted to make the voters think he was strong. In August 1964, off the coast of Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin incident took place. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was the USS Maddox, a ship in the American Navy, claimed that she was attacked by 3 North Korean gunboats. This led to an exchange of fire. The only result was there was a single machine gun bullet hole in the side of the USS Maddox. It really was nothing. But the American media and the White House played up the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which essentially authorized not just assistance, but now fighting by the Americans in Vietnam. There was a second Gulf of Tonkin incident. That likely didn't even happen, but it was still reported. The result was that by 1969, over 500,000 American troops were committed in Vietnam. This is the USS Maddox. Like I said, there was a lot of things that were not reported accurately, and I think it's fair to say some people lied in order to further political ends. From 1965 on, the Americans arrived in force. Their mission was largely defensive, but strategies were completely unsuited to the war. The Viet Cong were fighting with guerrilla tactics: strike, fade back into the mountains, and disappear into the civilian populations. The Americans were unable to respond because Washington, D.C., the president's defense team was controlling everything. This had never happened before in war, where the bureaucrats back in D.C. were limiting the army from doing the job. The American army has been remarkably effective at destroying its enemies, but it had never been hamstrung by having uncontrolled, unauthorized, ignorant bureaucrats back in the Home Office in D.C. who were not in the line of fire make decisions. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and others who followed ran the war from D.C. They picked individual targets. They would look over maps and show which buildings could be bombed and which buildings couldn't be bombed. That's no way to fight. That is ridiculous. So gradually the war in America grew more unpopular. This affected Johnson's poll numbers, which he was very aware of. So in 1968, the Viet Cong launched what was called the Tet Offensive. It was a major push. It was largely successful from a tactical point of view. The United States was forced to begin considering withdrawal. It proved also most of the reports back home were lies. Early on in the war, the American media stood with President Johnson and the Democrats and told the Americans how well the Vietnam War was going, even though it was largely not true. The Tet Offensive was sort of it was a bellwether in the sense that things changed. For years, there was an American journalist by the name of, I say journalist, not really, there was an American television reader by the name of Walter Cronkite, who used to end his evening broadcast with, "That's the way it is." And that's not true. What it would have been more reliable is to say, "That's the way I choose to tell you." Cronkite and others had made the decision that they were going to oppose the war, and so that also went hand in hand with the Americans' growing dissatisfaction with the Vietnam War. For a time, the U.S. stopped its bombing campaign. The North had Soviet weapons, which made them so deadly to the Americans. Early on, American bombers over North Vietnam were unopposed, but then as the Soviets supplied the North Vietnamese with modern surface-to-air missiles, it became very deadly. It seemed that the war would draw down. In 1968, President Johnson declined to run for president. He had no chance of winning, and he knew it, so he stepped aside. Republican Richard Nixon was elected in his place. Nixon's strategy was to try to prepare the South to take over and to simultaneously begin American withdrawal. This was called Vietnamization. So in 1969, Ho Chi Minh passed away. The Tet Offensive, which had been in 1968, had been tactical successfully, but not really strategically. The people of the South had not risen up to join North Vietnam. Both sides really entered a period of uncertainty in 1969. In order to buy the time necessary to turn things over to the South, Nixon reauthorized bombing. So this led to what was called Operation Linebacker 1 and Operation Linebacker 2. And the United States really turned up the pressure by bombing everything in North Korea. Now, this was not useful because by this time, the American goal was not to win the war. The American goal had never been to win the war, but especially now, the goal of Operation Linebacker 1 and 2 was simply to buy time. Now, strangely enough, though, many military tacticians sort of look at the results of Linebacker 1 and 2. Had the United States really kept the pressure up and done so, even in spite of losses, for another year or two, it's likely America could have won the Vietnam War. Now, I say won because eventually they would have lost it because the people they were fighting for didn't care. But it's just interesting, if the bureaucrats in D.C. had not interfered so much in the early parts of the war, the ending would have been different. So in 1973, President Nixon was able to end all American combat operations, and the United States troops began to evacuate. This is a B-52 bomber over Vietnam dropping bombs. And we are not talking, by the way, I want to specify this, American reactions to the war were very complex. So there is a irony of history here. The Vietnam War was largely a Democratic war. It was started by Democrats, continued by Democrats, and ended by a Republican. But when soldiers returned from Vietnam, they were treated in some distasteful and disgraceful ways. And so, because of this, there became a perception in America that to support Vietnam meant you were a Republican and to oppose Vietnam meant you were a Democrat. But once again, there's the irony. It was a Democratic war ended by Republicans, but support for the war was considered to be a Republican position, and opposition was considered to be a Democratic position. In actuality, there was a lot of hypocrisy. It's many who claim to be against the Vietnam War idolize John F. Kennedy, who had started the Vietnam War. And there, even to this day, is a lot of hypocrisy concerning the Vietnam War. But the one thing that was definitely true is that the way America treated Vietnam veterans when they returned is a black mark on American history. As the Americans left, the South fell. In 1975, Vietnam was under control of the communists in the North. The war had been lost. And it had been lost because the Soviets had supplied the North and turned it into a brutally expensive and demoralizing war for America. Keep that in mind because America is going to get its revenge within the next decade. But Vietnam had become a killing zone and a failure for America and an embarrassment. It had proved the Americans were not omnipotent, and it had been a bad thing. Communism appeared to be on the rise, and containment seemed to be failing. And we'll deal with more of that in the days ahead. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I understand when we talk about the Vietnam War, there is a lot of opinions. I'm doing the best I can to present things, but certainly I am making some judgments. I respect opposing judgments, and if you have different opinions, I completely understand. This is just the result of my reading and my study, but it is very complex. It is not as simple as this or that, A or B, black or white. Okay, we'll continue with more information, more history in the days ahead.